its status at the WTO as a developing country, meaning it would lose related benefits. Seoul's trade minister expresses to the U.S. the serious concerns of Korean farmers if that were to happen. The South Korean government urges people to stop using e-cigarettes following a suspected case of lung disease. It also urges lawmakers to pass bills that would allow for tighter control on their sale. And North Korean leader Kim Jong-un orders all South Korean facilities at the Mount Geumgang resort in the north to be removed. Unwelcome news for those who'd hoped the two sides would soon resume joint tourism at the resort. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. President Moon Jae-in met this afternoon at the Blue House with the King of Spain, Felipe VI. They discussed ways to strengthen bilateral cooperation in terms of the economy, science, and culture, especially ahead of their 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations next year. The two sides agreed to expand their joint construction project in developing countries, Spain, like Korea, having strength in construction. Korea and Spain will sign a set of MOUs on trade and tourism, and a dinner banquet will take place afterwards. King Felipe VI is on a two-day state visit to South Korea and is the first Spanish king to visit the country in 23 years. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has ordered the removal of all South Korean facilities at the Mount Geumgang tourist resort. There have been hopes that the two sides might soon find a way for South Koreans to go to Mount Geumgang, but this is definitely not a move in that direction. The South Korean government's trying to find out the North's intentions. Oh Jung-hee tells us more.
A key inter-Korean joint economic project, South Korean tours to North Korea's Geumgang mountain, is at risk. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un ordered the removal of South Korean facilities at the tourist resort, criticizing his father who had pushed ahead with the tours. According to North Korea's state-run Korean Central News Agency on Wednesday, Kim looked around the facilities at the Mount Geumgang tourist area that South Korea built when the tours first began. He strongly criticized the buildings, saying they, quote, aesthetically lag behind and look shabby. In a rare move, Kim criticized his own father, the former North Korean leader Kim Jong-il, who pushed ahead with the inter-Korean project, saying it was wrong to expect benefits by offering the area and depending on others. He ordered the removal of all South Korean facilities there after consulting with the South Korean side and stressed that the North will have to replace them with modern North Korean-style facilities. He added, Geumgang mountain is not an asset that's shared by the two Koreas and does not symbolize inter-Korean relations. The news took the South Korean government by surprise, especially as the two Koreas had agreed at the summit in September last year to resume South Korean tours to the mountain when conditions are ripe.
Kim's opinions were made through the North Korean media, so we're currently trying to find out the North's intentions and check factual details. The government will talk with the North if the North asks it to, in terms of protecting South Korean citizens' property and keeping the spirit of inter-Korean agreements.
South Korea has not yet received a proposal for talks from the North about this yet. Kim Jong-un's ordering of the demolition of South Korean facilities at the tourist resort is expected to raise issues, especially about whether South Korean assets there can be secured and whether the North is scrapping the inter-Korean joint declaration. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Hyundai Asan Corporation, the company that's led the tourism business with North Korea, said in a brief statement it was perturbed by the report of the North Korean leader's pledge, but said it would, quote-unquote, respond in a calm manner to developments. The United States has not changed its fundamental aim of denuclearizing North Korea. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the Trump administration is looking at a range of ways to achieve that goal, but will not use the tactics of previous administrations. Kim Da-mi reports.
For the first time since the breakdown of the working-level nuclear talks between Pyongyang and Washington in Sweden in early October, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has reiterated his country's firm stance of wanting North Korea's complete denuclearization. But Pompeo pointed out that the Trump administration cannot rely on failed strategies to convince Chairman Kim to give up his nuclear weapons. He added there is still much work to be done. Pompeo's latest remarks on North Korea came during his speech at the Heritage Foundation on Tuesday, along with comments on other global issues, including the recent Turkey-Syria crisis. Seen as refuting criticism on the lack of diplomatic progress over North Korea, Pompeo not only urged the North to return to the negotiating table, but also suggested taking new approaches to denuclearization talks, even those possibly proposed by Pyongyang. In fact, President Trump had previously hinted that there could be a major rebuild at a certain point, highlighting there is some very interesting information on North Korea. Washington and Pyongyang have seemingly been deadlocked in their denuclearization negotiations, as working levels did not resume in the 2 weeks anticipated by the U.S. after their breakdown earlier this month. But now the Trump administration seems to be willing to try something different to restart denuclearization negotiations. 김다미, Arirang News.
Sweden is planning to invite North Korea and the U.S. to hold another round of negotiations in Stockholm, where earlier this month they'd hosted a round of working-level talks. Meeting with reporters here in Seoul today, Sweden's special envoy to the Korean Peninsula, Kent Rolf Magnus Harstedt, said the timing and location will be determined based on what both Pyongyang and Washington can agree to. He was also optimistic about the future of such talks, saying both parties know this is a historic and realistic opportunity. South Korea and Russia are holding a joint military committee meeting to discuss setting up a hotline to prevent accidental intrusions into each other's air defense identification zones. During the talks today and tomorrow at Seoul's Joint Chiefs of Staff, the two sides are expected to discuss signing a memorandum of understanding on the hotline. Just yesterday, 6 Russian military aircraft entered the Korean air defense identification zone 4 times without prior notice. The South Korean Air Force responded by dispatching 10 fighter jets. Officials from South Korea and the U.S. are meeting this week in Hawaii for talks on how to share the cost of stationing American troops in South Korea. Before leaving for Hawaii on Tuesday, Seoul's newly appointed top negotiator, Jong-un said he will make sure that Seoul contributes a, quote, reasonable and equitable amount. These are the negotiations for the 11th such deal between the allies, the current one expiring at the end of this year. South Korea was to pay around $890 million in this year's deal, a rise of 8.2%. But President Trump wants Seoul to pay potentially billions of dollars more. South Korean Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon is in Tokyo, where yesterday he attended the Japanese emperor's enthronement. And today he's meeting with Japanese students and politicians, as well as Korean nationals. In the morning, Lee went to Keio University to talk with students about bilateral issues between South Korea and Japan. There he got a necktie from the students as a gift. He also attended a luncheon with South Koreans living in Japan. Later, he met with Japanese politicians, including the leader of the Komeito Party, which is part of Japan's ruling coalition. Now he's set to visit the Korean Cultural Center in Tokyo before attending a banquet dinner hosted by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Eyes will be on his one-on-one meeting tomorrow with Abe and whether that could help the two countries improve their ties. In football's Champions League, 2 more goals were scored Tuesday night by Tottenham Hotspur striker Son Heung-min. That gave his team a crucial 3 points in their group and put Son tied for the record of most goals scored by a South Korean in European football. Lee Seung-jae reports.
With Tottenham Hotspur taking on Serbian side Red Star Belgrade at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium on Tuesday night, South Korean striker Son Heung-min found the back of the net twice, once in the 16th minute and the other just before the first half whistle. The double gave him a second straight UCL match with a goal and his 5th goal in all competitions this season. Making the night even more special, Son's brace gave him his 120th and 121st goal in European matches, tying the record for the most European goals by a South Korean player, a record held for years by legendary Korean footballer Jong-un. This means 1 more goal, either in a Premier League or Champions League match, will make him the sole record holder. Having an incredible 2018-19 season with the London side, including a runner-up finish in last season's Champions League, Son became the only Asian footballer to be on the list of 30 nominees for this year's Ballon d'Or. Son is only the 3rd South Korean footballer to be nominated for the award after Son Heung-min in 2002 and Park Ji-sung in 2005. 이승재, Arirang News.
North Korea has lost the right to host the final of Asian football's second-tier club competition next week. The decision on Tuesday by the Asian Football Confederation comes a week after the surreal World Cup qualifier match between South and North Korea, which was played in an empty stadium in Pyeongyang with no live media coverage. In the statement, the AFC did not mention the inter-Korean showdown, but said the change of plan was due to the concerns of broadcasters and logistical challenges to working in Pyeongyang. The AFC Cup final between North Korea's April 25 Sports Club and Al-Ahed of Lebanon on November 2nd will instead be held on neutral ground in Shanghai. South Korean and U.S. officials are working to decide whether South Korea should keep its status as a developing country for trade purposes or be recognized as a developed country. It's an important decision because developing countries get special benefits at the World Trade Organization, and the U.S. is about to revoke that status. Our Kim Hae-sung explains.
South Korea's Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee said the government has conveyed its stance that the agriculture industry needs to be taken into account in deciding whether South Korea maintains its developing country status at the WTO. Her comments come after a meeting with U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and President Trump's top economic advisor Larry Kudlow in Washington on Tuesday local time. The trade minister said the U.S. highlighted how some countries that have already reached certain development levels still get special treatment through their developing nation status and that this hurts reform and development at the WTO. In July, President Trump accused some countries, including South Korea, that are among the world's richest economies, of abusing WTO's developing nation status. He said the U.S. will stop treating such countries as developing nations should the WTO fail to make substantial progress after 90 days, which is October 23rd. WTO privileges for developing economies include longer transition periods for implementing trade agreements, technical assistance, and protection against emergency import restrictions imposed by developed nations. The deprival of such status is expected to hurt South Korea's farmers who are protected by subsidies and tariffs on agricultural goods like rice. Trade Minister Yoo said the government will consider Korea's national interest, its global economic status, the global economic environment, and stakeholders related to the matter and make its decision on whether to keep its WTO developing nation status later this month. Meanwhile, the meeting between government officials and farmers' representatives on Tuesday in Seoul to discuss the issue ended abruptly after the farmers' demand to have the meeting open to the public was not accepted. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
Also at the WTO, South Korea says it will strengthen its efforts there to win its dispute with Japan over Tokyo's trade curbs and will thoroughly prepare for the WTO's eventual ruling. In a meeting Wednesday, representatives from the government, the presidential office, and the ruling party discussed countermeasures to Japan's trade restrictions on South Korea, and the three sides agreed to call on the international community to support a swift resolution of the issue. They also agreed to continue working to boost South Korea's industrial competitiveness on top of the success some firms have already had in overcoming the trade curbs. South Korea argues that with the trade curbs, Japan violated international trade rules by retaliating against Seoul for a court ruling last year, ordering certain Japanese firms to compensate the Koreans forced to work for Japan during wartime. The U.S.-China trade wars left South Korea's economy vulnerable because the country relies heavily on exports of intermediate goods. The Institute for International Trade says South Korea's exports of intermediate goods last year accounted for over 71% of its exports in total, substantially more than China's 44% and Germany's 46%. In contrast, Korea's exports of consumer goods were below 11%, less than half of China's 26% and Germany's 25%. To mitigate the risk, the Institute said South Korea should ship more consumer goods like cosmetics and cars. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news today, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Song Sooyoung, Professor of Business at Geumgang University. Dr. Song, thank you for coming on today.
Yeah, my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me again.
Sure. Well, the U.S. Trade Representative has announced that it'll soon start accepting applications for companies that want an exemption from the 15% tariff on Chinese goods that took effect last month. Has there been much of a market reaction to this, and what's your outlook for the global economy in the near term?
Actually, the delay of the impose of the tariff, what was scheduled in October 15th was delayed. So I think that is a really good news, and particularly the U.S. importers from China actually have submitted some tariff exemption as early as October, and most of the companies have suffered from the tariff imposed on the Chinese imports because those companies cannot find some other alternative sources to import. So, to that regard, I think that is not only beneficial to the domestic manufacturing companies in U.S. and also it could be accepted as a kind of some hospit-friendly signal to our outlook of the world trade for the upcoming years.
It's interesting that story did not make huge news internationally, but it's an important story potentially. Now, as we just heard, President Trump and others have brought up the question of whether certain countries, including South Korea, should really be classified at the WTO as developing countries, considering their status today. And now South Korea's trade minister said a decision on that status could come soon. What would happen if Korea were to give up its developing status and be recognized as a developed country?
Yeah, actually, I look into WTO and I find actually WTO does not classify the officially at all. Only the World Bank and the other some institutions classify Korea as developed countries or the high-income countries. But however, the WTO has offered some preferential treatment particularly during the transition period from some less developed into developing and then finally developed countries. So Korea is in the process of the transition from the developing to developed countries. Korea has requested, as far as I know, some special preferential treatment for the rice industry, agricultural economy in Korea. So it is accepted. It was accepted, but however, because particularly the Korean government has imposed almost a 513% tariff on the rice, so that provides a huge protection for the Korean farmers who particularly specialize in rice production. However, as the consumption of the rice has been declining for the past several decades, and also particularly the U.S. President put the pressure on, he would like to open the rice market in Korea because for the American farmers who grow rice to export rices to the Korean market. So to that regard, I think the Korea is going to anyway accept the pressure and then make up some kind of compensation for opening the agricultural rice market to the U.S. and other countries. So I think the U.S. and other countries such as Vietnam and some countries is interested in, but this may be not a big deal in lieu of the current trade dispute and trade issue. So anyway, I think it's better to move out of these developing country status because that would be beneficial for the Korea when out in economic status in WTO, we are already treated and as developed countries. So I think that that would be better to withdraw.
Well, it's a fascinating question, but to move on to South Korean domestic issues, the National Assembly started deliberation on next year's supersized budget of 513 trillion won, about $440 billion. Some say this could strain the government's finances. Others say it's not a problem. What do you think?
If that is a problem to Korean economy and the Korean government, then already we are going to see so many countries, government that already have suffered from some strain of the government deficit on the particularly the GDP percentage against the government debt percentage of the GDP. So to that regard, the IMF and all the other world renowned institutions point out that particularly South Korea has been very healthy and robust in terms of the government budget or the deficit. Therefore, right now we are in the position that declining economic growth rate, that is mainly due to some worldwide declining trade and particularly because of the U.S. and China trade dispute. So consequently, we have no other tools to buttress and to rejuvenate the economic growth rate, but fiscal policy. So as long as our economy and the status is strong enough, why not use that tool to promote and to rejuvenate the economic growth rate? So I don't think that is the political rhetoric to blame the increase of the government deficit. However, the good government should give more than they take away from the people. So that naturally entails that the government deficit should be increased. Otherwise, it means that as long as government behave as if some profit-seeking entrepreneur or enterprise, then they are going to take levy taxes more than they could return.
So bottom line, the South Korean government can handle it. Sounds like that's the consensus. All right, Dr. Song, thanks so much for coming on today. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
Now, like in many other countries, there are growing concerns in South Korea about the health risks of e-cigarettes. Now the health ministry is urging people to stop using them and wants lawmakers to pass tougher bills on controlling their sale. Our Kim Bo-kyung has this report.
Back in September, the health ministry advised people not to use liquid-type e-cigarettes. But now the ministry is issuing a stronger warning over their use.
Firstly, the ministry strongly urges people to stop using e-cigarettes, especially children, teenagers, pregnant women, and people with respiratory diseases.
The ministry recommended teens to stop using e-cigarettes immediately. It also urged lawmakers to tighten controls on e-cigarettes by passing several pending bills. If the bills are passed, the government would be able to extend the definition of cigarettes to include e-cigarettes. The current definition is restricted to cigarettes made from tobacco leaves. The bill would also force manufacturers and importers to submit information about harmful substances and would allow the government to ban companies from putting flavors in cigarettes to discourage teens from starting vaping. The ministry also seeks to amend the current law to let the government recall cigarettes and ban the sales of the product if it is found to harm people's health. These measures follow a suspected case of lung disease related to vaping, which was reported over a week ago in Korea, as well as a rise in the number of diseases and deaths in the United States that have been blamed on e-cigarettes. According to U.S. Centers for Disease Control, 1,479 lung disease cases associated with the use of e-cigarettes or vaping products have been reported as of October 15th. E-cigarettes are thought to be behind 33 deaths of patients in the U.S., but the cause of the deaths is yet to be confirmed. Thus, the CDC has recommended people not to use e-cigarettes or vaping products in order to avoid the risk. And e-cigarette giant Juul decided to temporarily stop selling certain flavored e-cigarettes online about a week ago, with states such as Massachusetts and Washington also temporarily banning e-cigarette sales. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.
Bismarck sheds light on the advanced technologies and improved competitiveness of domestic startups